The message arrived at 11:47 p.m., not through diplomatic channels, not through an ambassador, through a back-channel communication that bypassed every protocol Burkina Faso had ever established with Washington. And the words inside it were not a request. They were not a suggestion. They were an ultimatum, delivered in the language of a country that had spent 70 years mistaking its military budget for a moral compass. Ibrahim Traoré read it once, set it down, read it again. Then he looked at the man who had brought it to him and said something that no African leader had said to Washington in over 2 decades. Tell them no. The aide's face went pale because they both understood what that word would cost. What had triggered it was a speech, 47 minutes long, delivered without a teleprompter, without a script, without the careful diplomatic cushioning that Western powers had trained African leaders to wrap around every sentence that might displease them. Traoré had stood before his people in Ouagadougou, and he had said, plainly and without apology, that the era of Africa taking orders from foreign capitals was finished. He had named no names. He had pointed no fingers. But every intelligence analyst from Langley to London understood exactly who he was talking about. And within 72 hours, the back-channel message had arrived. Now the question was not whether Washington would respond. It already had. The question was what came next, and whether Traoré had anticipated it deeply enough to survive it. He had. But the people around him were about to discover that surviving Washington's displeasure was only the first layer of the trap. The second layer was already closing in from a direction no one expected, and it had nothing to do with the United States. The statement had gone viral before sunrise, not because American media had amplified it. They had done the opposite. They had buried it, mocked it, reduced it to a footnote in a segment about instability in the Sahel, a phrase that Western broadcasters used whenever African leaders made decisions that Washington had not pre-approved. But the burial had backfired spectacularly. Every time an American anchor rolled their eyes, 1 million people across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia shared the original clip. Every time a think tank analyst called Traoré reckless, another 100,000 people watched his full 47-minute speech for the first time. The American media's panic had become the most effective distribution system the speech could have asked for. By the time Traoré was sitting in his office reading that ultimatum, his words had been viewed over 40 million times. African presidents who had said nothing for years were suddenly being asked by their own citizens why they hadn't said the same thing. The tremor Traoré had sent through the geopolitical ground beneath the continent was not stopping. If anything, it was deepening, which is exactly why certain people much closer to Traoré than Washington, had decided that the moment to move against him was now. His head of external intelligence came to him at dawn, Colonel Amadou Sawadogo, a man Traoré had trusted for 3 years, a man who had stood beside him through coups, counter-coups, and the invisible war of sanctions that foreign powers had waged against Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Sawadogo sat down across from him with the expression of someone carrying a weight they hadn't agreed to carry. "There's something you need to see," Sawadogo said. He slid a folder across the table. Traoré opened it without urgency. He had learned long ago that panic was a luxury he could not afford. What was inside the folder was a series of communications, intercepted, verified, dated, between 3 members of his inner security circle and a financial intermediary with documented connections to a foreign lobbying firm operating out of Washington and Brussels. The communication spanned 6 weeks. They had begun 4 days after his speech was first announced internally. The 3 men named in those communications had attended his security briefing the previous evening. They had sat in that room and listened to contingency plans for exactly the kind of pressure Washington was now applying. And then, according to what Traore was reading, they had sent summaries of those plans out of the country within hours. He closed the folder. He looked at Sawadogo. "You verified all of this?" "3 independent sources. The financial transfers are confirmed." Traore nodded slowly. "And they don't know that you know?" "Not yet." "Good." He stood up, walked to the window. The city was beginning to move below him. The ordinary morning machinery of a country that had survived more betrayals than it had ever deserved to absorb. "Leave them in place," he said. Sawadogo blinked. "Sir, leave them exactly where they are. Do not arrest them. Do not confront them. Do not change their access." He turned around. "If they believe they are still trusted, they will keep transmitting, and everything they transmit from this point forward will be information I have chosen for them to transmit." This was the moment, though Sawadogo didn't fully understand it yet, when the trap reversed direction entirely. Washington believed it was running an operation against Traore. The 3 compromised men believed they were feeding intelligence to a network that would eventually destabilize his position. But Traore had just converted their entire operation into a pipeline that now ran the other direction. Every piece of information that flowed out through those men would from this point be a piece of information Traore had engineered, shaped to lead the external pressure campaign exactly where he wanted it to go. He was not angry. He was not frightened. He was thinking 4 moves ahead in a game his opponents had not yet realized he was playing. The American media escalation came the following morning. 3 major cable networks ran segments within hours of each other, a coordination that was too precise to be coincidental. Framing Traore's statement as the declaration of a rogue regime, analysts appeared in succession, each one escalating the language of the previous one, building a rhetorical architecture designed to justify whatever came next. One former State Department official called the speech destabilizing for the entire region. Another called Burkina Faso's current trajectory a security threat that demands a coordinated international response. The phrase coordinated international response had a specific history on that continent, and every person watching from Ouagadougou understood exactly what it was designed to mean. What the analysts did not understand was that Traore had watched every one of those segments before they finished airing. He had a team monitoring the narrative being constructed in real time, and what he saw was not a threat. What he saw was a confession, because the speed of the media response, the synchronized language, the specific framing, all of it confirmed what his intelligence reports had only suggested before. The operation against him was being coordinated at a level that required significant institutional infrastructure. This was not a spontaneous reaction. This had been prepared, which meant it had been prepared before his speech had become globally viral, which meant someone had warned them in advance that the speech was coming. He went back to Sawadogo. When was the first communication from the 3 compromised men sent? Sawadogo checked his notes. 6 days before the speech was delivered publicly. Traore said nothing for a long moment. 6 days before the speech was public knowledge. Someone inside his inner circle had told foreign-connected operatives that it was coming. Well, that meant the coordinated international response framework had been built in the week before Africans even heard his words. The American panic, the synchronized media segments, the ultimatum through the back channel. None of it was a reaction to what he had said. All of it was a pre-positioned response that had been waiting for a trigger. He had been the trigger, but he had not been the cause. The cause was the simple fact that he existed and refused to be managed. understanding that distinction changed everything about how he would respond. He called a press conference that afternoon, not to respond to the American media narrative, not to defend himself against the framing that was being constructed internationally. He called the press conference to do something that caught every diplomat and analyst observing the situation completely off guard. He released the full, unedited text of the back-channel ultimatum he had received, every word of it. Without redaction, without commentary, he stood at the podium and he read it aloud, calmly in French, and then waited as his communications team released the simultaneous translation into English, Arabic, Swahili, Portuguese, and Mandarin. He didn't call it an ultimatum. He called it a document. He didn't characterize it or frame it. He simply let the language inside it characterize itself, because the language inside it was extraordinary. It referenced consequences for regional stability. It referenced the withdrawal of multilateral support structures. And most revealingly, it referenced the need for Burkina Faso's leadership to align its public communications with the expectations of its strategic partners. That last phrase, align its public communications with the expectations of its strategic partners, detonated across the global conversation like a slow-moving explosion, because it meant, written plainly in the language of a back-channel message that was never supposed to become public, that a foreign power expected an African head of state to clear his speeches through their approval process before delivering them to his own people. The American media had spent 48 hours building a narrative about Traore being reckless and destabilizing. He had just made that narrative impossible to sustain, because now the question being asked in every newsroom, every parliament, every diplomatic corridor was not, is Traore dangerous? The question now was, who wrote that message and who authorized it, and how long has this been standard operating procedure? Washington went silent. Not immediately. There was a 12-hour period of furious background noise, of officials speaking anonymously to journalists, of framing attempts that collapsed almost as quickly as they were constructed. But by the second evening after Traore released the document, the silence was real, institutional, strategic silence. The kind that meant that the people making decisions had recognized that continuing to engage was making their position worse, not better. The three compromised men inside Traore's security circle sent an urgent communication the night the document went public. He knew because Ouagadougou was monitoring everything. The message they sent was a single question: what happens now? The response from their handlers outside the country was equally brief: stand by. Stand by. The two words of an operation that had lost its footing. Stand by meant, we don't know. Stand by meant, we didn't anticipate this. Stand by meant, the man you were supposed to be helping us neutralize has just turned our most powerful pressure tool into a public indictment of our entire strategy, and we need time to recalibrate. They would not get that time, because Traore's next move was not another press conference. It was a phone call, one that surprised every observer who had been tracking the situation. He called the leaders of 4 other African nations, all of whom had received similar back-channel communications from various Western capitals over the previous 18 months. Communications that had never been made public because their recipients had been afraid to make them public. He spoke to each one personally. He did not tell them what to do. He simply told them what he had done, and why, and what had happened afterward. And then he said, the silence on the other side is the evidence that transparency is the only weapon they cannot plan against, because everything else they have prepared for. They have not prepared for truth. 3 of the 4 leaders he called agreed to publish their own documents within the week. The 4th declined, But the fourth silence, Traore understood, was its own kind of information, and he filed it away without judgment and without suspicion he wasn't ready to verify. The Western media coverage shifted in a way that was almost physically visible. The vocabulary changed. Rogue regime gave way to sovereign dispute. Security threat gave way to diplomatic tensions. The analysts who had been most aggressive in their language began qualifying, softening, retreating into academic abstraction. Two of the networks ran follow-up segments that, without ever acknowledging they had been wrong, nevertheless reframed the entire situation in terms that were measurably less hostile than what they had broadcast 3 days earlier. This was not because they had developed a conscience. This was because the story had become too big to manage from only one direction. Wasin and they were adjusting to protect their institutional credibility. But the story was not finished, because the three compromised men were still in place, still trusted by their handlers, still transmitting. And for the past 72 hours, everything they had transmitted had been information Traore had specifically prepared for them. He had fed them three things. First, a fabricated internal disagreement between himself and Sawadogo, a fictional power struggle designed to make external actors believe that his intelligence apparatus was fractured. Second, a false contingency plan suggesting that he was preparing to make a series of economic concessions that would give the appearance of softening his public position without actually changing it. Third, and most carefully designed, be a series of internal memos suggesting that Traore believed the document release had been his final move, that he had played his best card and was now in a consolidation phase, not an offensive one. All three pieces of information were false. All three were designed to create a specific response from external actors, and that response arrived exactly when he had calculated it would. The external handlers, believing the intelligence they were receiving, made a decision. They instructed the three compromised men to arrange a formal meeting, framed as a security briefing, at which they would propose a specific alternative plan for Burkina Faso's relationship with Western financial institutions. The meeting was framed as legitimate. It was actually an attempt to use the fabricated power struggle Traore had planted as a wedge to bring him a compromise offer at what his handlers believed was a moment of internal weakness. Traore agreed to the meeting. He let it proceed to the point where the proposal was fully articulated. He let the three men deliver it. He let them explain the terms. And then he looked at all three of them and said, with a quietness that was somehow more unsettling than any raised voice, "I know what you are. I know who you're speaking to. I know when you started, and I know what you've sent, and I know what they told you in return." He set Sawadogo's verified folder on the table between them. "Everything in this room for the past 10 minutes has been recorded, and I want you to understand something clearly, not as enemies, but as men who made a choice under circumstances I don't fully know." He paused. "You have one opportunity to tell me the complete truth, everything, all of it. If you take that opportunity, what happens next is something I decide on the basis of what you tell me. If you don't take it, what happens next is already decided." Two of them spoke immediately. One of them took longer, but by the end of the night, all three had given everything they had. The full network, the full financial structure, the full chain of communication that connected back-channel ultimatums to media coordination to internal penetration. What they revealed was larger than Sawadogo had initially mapped. It extended into multilateral institutions. It touched 3 separate foreign embassies. And it included a financial mechanism that had been operating for years before Traore had ever made a speech. He did not publicize their names. He did not arrest them publicly. He gave each of them a specific role in a controlled process that would dismantle the network they had described from the inside over the following months. Not because he was merciful beyond reason, but because public arrests would have told external actors exactly how much he knew and how quickly he had moved. Silence, in this case, was a more precise instrument. He needed the external architecture of the operation to remain confident for long enough that he could map every node of it. 3 public arrests would have triggered an immediate shutdown of all the moving parts he hadn't reached yet. And 3 men quietly redirected would keep the machinery running just long enough for him to understand its full shape. This was not improvisation. This was a man who had thought about how power actually worked, not how it was described in Western policy papers or diplomatic playbooks, but how it moved through silence and money and information and fear, and had built his response around the real topology of the threat rather than its surface appearance. The following month was a controlled demolition, not loud, not dramatic. Each element of the operation against Burkina Faso's sovereignty was quietly identified and quietly neutralized. Financial channels were interrupted at their source. Embassy personnel whose activities went beyond their official roles found their access to key meetings mysteriously dried up. The multilateral leverage that had been built up over years, the threat of withdrawing economic support structures, became effectively unusable because Traore had spent the previous weeks deepening alternative partnerships that his opponents had not mapped, in part because the information they had been receiving through the compromised men had been engineered to make those partnerships appear less advanced than they were. When the Western pressure campaign finally attempted to activate its economic component, the withdrawal of specific multilateral support mechanisms that had been designed to give maximum pain with minimum public visibility, it encountered something it had not modeled for: a Burkina Faso that had already moved. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without real difficulty for real people, but a country that had reorganized enough of its critical dependencies in the preceding weeks that the withdrawal, when it came, landed on ground that had already been prepared to absorb it. The American media covered it briefly. A short segment. Measured language. No triumph in their framing, because triumph would have required acknowledging what the previous 2 months had actually been. Traore held no victory press conference. He gave no speech about having outmaneuvered Washington or exposed foreign interference, even though he had done both. He went back to his work, the daily, grinding, unglamorous work of governing a country that was still fragile, still surrounded by pressures it hadn't chosen, still carrying wounds that no diplomatic victory could simply erase. And because he understood something that the people, Kreml, who had moved against him had never fully grasped. Sovereignty was not a speech. It was not a viral moment or a document released at a press conference. It was a daily practice, rebuilt every morning in the choices that no one was watching. What he had done was create the conditions under which that daily practice could continue. He had protected the space in which his country could make its own decisions. He had refused to be managed, refused to be corrupted, refused to allow the external architecture of control that had been built around Burkina Faso to operate without cost. And in doing so, he had sent a message that no press conference, no media segment, and no back-channel ultimatum could retract. The message was simple. It was not about Trump. But it was not about America specifically or the West as an abstraction. It was about something older and more fundamental than any particular political moment. It was about whether a country, any country, had the right to decide its own direction without requiring approval from the outside. Whether a leader could stand in front of his own people and say what he actually believed without first checking if the right foreign capitals were comfortable with it. Whether the word sovereignty meant anything at all, or whether it was simply a decorative term that powerful countries permitted weaker ones to use as long as it never inconvenienced anyone with money. Ibrahim Traoré had answered that question, not with a slogan, not with a declaration, with a sequence of decisions made under real pressure, in real time, at real personal risk, and that had taken every instrument of external control that had been arranged against him and either neutralized it or turned it around. He stood at his window again. The city below him was the same city it had been at dawn 2 months ago when Sawadogo had brought him the folder, fragile, complicated, unfinished, carrying 40 kinds of hope and 40 kinds of difficulty simultaneously, the way all real places do. He was not under any illusion that the pressure was finished. He knew with complete clarity that new pressure would come, that the work of sovereignty was never final, that the people who believed they had the right to manage African governments had not abandoned that belief simply because one attempt had failed. But the attempt had failed. Completely, thoroughly. And on a public stage large enough that its failure was now part of the information that every similar operation, in every similar country, would have to factor into its planning. The cost of trying to manage Ibrahim Traoré had turned out to be higher than the cost of leaving him alone. And that calculation, that cold, institutional calculation, was ultimately the only language that the kind of power he had been facing ever truly understood. He turned from the window. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And he was still standing